Alright, if you're here to learn how to build Rally apps and extend our platform with JavaScript, you are in the right place. In this session, we're going to cover tips, tricks, and patterns. My name is David Thomas. I'm a systems engineer on the sales team here at Rally Software. I live out in Santa Cruz, California. So I've come up with the following 10 tips, tricks, and patterns. Now, let me just have a quick aside here and say, not every developer may agree with all the things that I've said here. This is what's working for me. They're tips and tricks that I've come up with over the years. I'm getting better every time I sit down and code. So my usage of these is improving. So if you're advanced and you look at this and say, well, God, there's definitely an easier way. Well, maybe there is. But if you're just getting started, I'm expecting and I'm hoping that these will at least level you up, one level up. So with that, starting from one, we're going to cover some basic just app design. Then we're going to go down and talk about how to manage creating components, sort of doing longhand division as opposed to all the fancy shorthand stuff that you'll see. Yeah, that's the list. Let's just go through and kick it off. All right, so the first one, app design. This one is about favoring reusable methods over deep nesting. Now what you'll find on the left, here's an example of deep nesting. What'll end up happening is that you'll create, like for example in your launch function, you'll create a combo box, and that'll have a listener for us if someone selects something from the combo box. And then from there, once you select something, you'll create a data store and go fetch data based on what they selected. And then once that loads, you go and create a new grid with the data, right? And you can see how you can very easily nest and keep going, right? On the right is the pattern, and you saw this in the example of code, which is to create several methods, and those methods create a separation of concerns. So on the right near the top, we have our launch function. That launch function creates our first combo box, and it sets up the event handler to load data. Once that data loads, it goes down and calls another method called load data. That one will call the data store and do another fetch, getting some stories like in our example, and then call a method called build grid, and it calls a method to actually do the building the grid. And what you'll find is that, especially when you have to do that update workflow path that we talked about, you'll call some of these methods from different angles or different avenues. So having reusable methods is a much cleaner approach. Plus, it's testable. Now, I'll have to admit that the testing aspect of JavaScript appears to be it's a bit of a challenge in the community as I'm learning. So there's no obvious just like drop in a quick test framework. They're out there, but in any case, it's much easier to test small methods, and it's a better design pattern in any case. For writing maintainable code. So this is a pattern I use. You saw it in the examples we had in the prior two sessions with doing coding. And I think it's just a lot easier to debug and also just read the code. All right. So tip number 2 is favor the longhand approach to creating your X components. And this is really something about when you're just getting started with X and using our SDK. And as you get more comfortable, maybe you'll move into those optimized shorthand notations. But at the end of the day, and what we've been doing the last 2 sessions with writing code is we've been using the x.create method, giving it the fully qualified name of the object that we want to create and the full config. Once we have that object, we add it to the app, to the container of our app. What you'll find is that when you come back to your app 2 weeks, 4 weeks later, if you just have that pattern, it's very easy to kind of see what you're doing. There is a shorthand notation. We've seen a few times already this notion of X type, and X type is an X way of defining an object that you want to create very lazily. What I mean by that is that when the object is needed or used, then it is actually created. In our way, when we do X.create, we're creating it, and it's just whether we use it or not, whether it's displayed or not, it's going to be created. And there's pros and cons to that, but I'm going to lean towards writing just more descriptive code up front. So I'd advocate for that. So here's a quick example of that. So along the top, just going top down real quick, and it's just kind of pseudocode, so you have to excuse a little bit of the placeholders. But along the top, we have our launch function we call doLayout, and in doLayout, this is a function that we're going to have our concerns are going to be just laying out the general app and the visual components of our app. So you can see in the doLayout, we create this app object, and it's basically just a container. Maybe it's a panel object, just a high-level panel that we're going to stuff a bunch of stuff inside. And then we're creating a pull-down, we're creating a grid, We're creating another container, which is a button list. We have an OK button, a cancel button. Now we're halfway down this slide. Now we're going to add the buttons to the button list. And then at the very end here, we're saying, okay, now let's go into our app. Let's put our pull down. Let's put our grid. Let's put our button list, right? We're kind of nesting all these containers. And this is very much the longhand version, using x.create and doing the explicit adds. But I think what you'll notice is that it's just a very clean, consistent way of writing and organizing your code. There are 3 or 4 different ways I've used to do the exact same thing, but you really kind of have to know a little bit more about the internals of the life cycle of apps, and this is it's just easier, so I'd stick to it. So number 3, this one I got a good tip from one of our Agile coaches and programmer extraordinaires, John Martin, and he advocates just doing the smallest thing you can do and test it, right? And that's that, don't try and batch up a day's worth of changes and test it at the end of the day. That's very obvious. But especially when writing JavaScript and knowing how finicky it can be and dealing with the scoping and stuff like that, do the smallest thing you can do and test it, and just keep that pattern in mind. And I'm going to augment that with my own personal belief, which is you need to automate that build, test, and deploy as much as possible. You saw that with the use of the app template that I used. I pulled from GitHub, and we have those rake commands for rake build, rake deploy. Right, that's just an example of automation. What you'll find is if you don't have that automation, if the mechanism of getting your code into something to test is clunky or time-consuming or manual, you'll find that you won't do it as often, and you'll batch up your changes, and it just makes things a lot harder to debug if something does break. I'd also recommend taking it one step further, and I've done this. I didn't show it because I didn't want to be super automated and have too much behind the scenes going on, but I've hooked up those rake commands to hotkeys in my editor in VI, and so I can do like /rd for rally deploy or /rb for rally build. And that makes it just like even that much better. I've also done something where I've hooked up VI to Firefox, where I could actually tell the browser to reload from the command line. So I can actually do a rally /rd for deploy, and that will actually push the code out into the cloud. And then when that's finished, when the deploy's finished, I'll go and tell the browser to refresh itself. And I was using the Moz REPL plugin for Firefox. And in that case, I didn't even have to use a mouse to do testing, which is just wicked. It was one example. And you should use VI. It's good for you. All right, the 4th one is debugging with the console. As you saw in our examples, did a lot of debugging using console.log. I showed earlier on console debug and console error, and console error has that stack trace in the console, and that's really nice. Get comfortable with that, because this is really your insight into understanding what's going on behind the scenes. Even if you're not familiar with all the Ext framework, and as you saw when I would dump out like a store to the log, and I kind of navigate down, and I'm just kind of looking, I'm just sniffing out, is there something that looks like what I'm looking for? And I don't know all the internals, but being able to log that and just look provides a lot of insight into what's going on behind the scenes, and it's a good learning opportunity. Those console logs do a really good job of printing your objects and your data. And also you can have you can put multiple objects in your console logs. You don't have to have 5 of them just printing out one thing each. There's actually you can kind of aggregate those, and the display of those objects is actually still pretty nice. You can actually kind of drill in, and the browser's debug console does a good job of making it easy to navigate, even lots of data. One note though, and I kind of picked this up recently, is that the console APIs are implemented by the browsers. And there's a lot of talk about not guaranteeing that a browser will implement a particular aspect of the API. So you want to be really careful about deploying code that has the console API. I personally have never had a problem with it. I've probably put a couple apps out that have console stuff in it, so it's not the end of the world. But since I've picked up on it, I just want to share that you want to be cautious of that. So I'd probably just do a good job of commenting that out or something. Here's a good example. You can find an API and look at all the things that are available. At least here's an example of the Chrome's implementation of console, of how you can use the various things like log and debug and error. Honestly, I just use console log and I call it a day. I haven't gotten too fancy with like error handling to a T. Not like I would with Java or Ruby, but something to explore. But definitely use the console. Okay, number 5. Remember we talked about in the first session, we talked about scope was one of those things where it's like one of the top three things I wanted to show somebody was understanding the notion of scope. And hopefully in our examples you saw some good, or you got a good sense of how to interpret what that variable this means, and as we start getting nested, how you want to change the value of that with that resetting the scope. There's one little trick I've noticed recently where folks will, in a particular function, they'll create a new variable called me, as an example, and they'll set it to this. And that's just saying that as of right now in my function, the context of this, I'm going to refer to it as me. And so if the variable this, as the variable this changes through JavaScript, as scope changes and as you define functions, the variable of this will take on a new life because it has new contexts. But the variable of me will always be persistent because you've set it to what this is at that point in time. And so here's an example. I took a copy of code from one of the combo boxes we created, and in this case, what I did is at the top of a function, I just said var me equals this, and then in my combo box, remember we had to set scope and pass scope into the listeners. Well, I just said scope equal me, and then in my listener, when I do say this refers to me. Now it's still scoping is convoluted, and you have to earn your lashes on here, but what you'll find is that this pattern of using me, this is one case where using me, as you start looking through this code, just seeing me, scope me down here, it tells me that I want the app. I want to be passing in the app. You may want to choose, as I see here in blue and green, that maybe you want to change a different name as opposed to me, so maybe use the word app, so you can say scope is the app, which is what you want. You want to be using those, referring to methods at the app level, or referring to variables at the app level. But find something that works for you. But this is kind of a neat little trick that I think you should explore, or not, and just use this and console log this if it's not what you expect it to be. All right, number 6, storing components, X components, as app attributes. Now this is definitely one of those where to be honest, I had to just have enough experience to understand why I would do this. And so if someone told me up front, I'd have no clue why. But trust me, once you start getting into slightly more complex apps with just enough components, and you have to look up components, this will become relevant. So usually what happens is that deep in your code, you realize that you need to access some component somewhere else, right? So you've created this little checkbox, and if you check it, you want to resort your grid, which is located somewhere else in your app. And you have to find that grid in order to do that action. So you have two options, or at least two that I'll present. One is that in your little checkbox code in this example, you simply call this.myGrid, and because you've created that variable myGrid on the app itself, and this refers to your app in that scope. And so ultimately what the pattern, and you saw this pattern already, is that your app, the one that you actually wrote, the actual app you wrote, it's just a JavaScript object, and you can create new attributes or variables on that app. Just name value pairs, right? That's what we said in the intro. Working with JavaScript objects is just name value pairs, so you can create new names and assign new values to any object as well as your app. Your second option is that you can leverage the XJS framework, and they have this mechanism for using IDs and item IDs on components, and then have mechanisms to look them up by IDs, and that's another way that you can go and look up things. All right. So because this is, you have to use one of the two at some point, right? Especially as you start to have 2, 3, 4, 5 components. So you definitely want to take it. You want to focus on this, and my recommendation, my suggestion is use option 1. I'm going to show you option 2 because it exists, and you might see code doing it, and you wonder why it looks so complex. But I just want to be complete. So with option 1. I'm making this recommendation simply because it takes the KISS approach. It's just keep it simple. It may not be the most elegant way, but it works. It's simple. It's not the XD way, but it works. So at the end of the day, the apps that you write in Rally, they're going to be small apps, right? Maybe you'll have 3, 4, maybe 10 components and widgets and controls, but you're not writing this full-on 80 KB desktop app or something like that. It's really crazy. So just take advantage of the fact that that JavaScript objects are open. You can add name value pairs, and that's how we're going to do this. So in this example here in our like do layout function, we're basically saying this.myGrid. We're saying we're going to create a new variable on the object on the app, assuming that this points to the app, which it should in our examples so far. Create a variable, an attribute called myGrid, and set it equal to this whole honkin' panel. And so now anywhere in the app, as long as you have access to the app via this variable, you can just say myGrid. So if you're down in some other function, right, you're way down, nested down in your little checkbox, and you say this.myGrid, you have access to the grid. So it's kind of like the global, if you will, access to the grid object because you've attached it to the app. Now, option 2 is that when you create those components with XCreate, you set an ID or an item ID. Now, it took me a little while to understand this, and I wish someone told me this, but when you create an object, you can say ID:foo on a component, and that will give the item an ID. And if you actually look in the HTML, that's the ID of the div tag, to be honest. But you want to think of the ID as like a serial number, right? You can only have one serial number on your app for a component. They're unique. Whereas item ID is kind of like a model number, where you can have several, maybe you have several buttons, and they all have an item ID of a clickable button. They're all clickables or something, or they're all like user buttons. Just some way to kind of group them and identify them. That's what item ID is. So when you go looking for something, if you're looking up by ID, you will get 1. If you go looking for an item ID, you may get 0 or more. At the end of the day, here's a quick example. In this example of do layout, I created 2 grids, and I gave them the same item ID. Just call it display panel. I don't know, whatever. And I think, do I have a typo? Yeah, I forgot a little brace here. But in any case, you get the point. 2 different grids, same item ID. So now in the bottom half here, when I'm somewhere else in my app and I want to go look up one of those, I can do this thing called X component query pound display panel, and this will do a query looking for any component that has display panel as an item ID. And so I want to get maybe I want to get they're zero based. It's a zero based array, so maybe I want to pick out the second one, which is my column grid, and then call the method on it, right? So I have to do this lookup, and the component query is kind of looking in this global collection of components that X knows about. So it's kind of global in the same way that we kind of in option 1 we added the variable to our app. With X, every time you do x.create, it's going to register the component with this sort of global list, if you will. And I'll just look up from the list. To be honest, I've done this before. I don't mind it as much, but I think just from a simplicity standpoint, if you're just starting out, use option 1. Once you start getting complex, and you have to have more little structure and rigor around it, you'll definitely want to take advantage of the ID and item ID mechanism. Okay, number 7, store your app in GitHub. Start early. If you haven't used GitHub, it's easier than you think. I've been using version control systems for 15 years, and while I think Git is interesting from the command line perspective, I like it about as much as I do Perl. The folks at GitHub have made it fairly easy just to get in, check in code, check it out, keep it as simple as possible. So highly recommend going there, getting an account. On the right-hand side here on the screenshot, it's kind of small, but on the right-hand side, like here's when I log in, this is what it looks like. And on the right, I can see a list of my repositories. So if I'm just creating an app, I'll click this button. It says New Repository. And then on the left here, I'll get a repository, and I'll start checking in my files. And you get access to all the goodies of GitHub. What I find is that when you start using version control, and this is kind of an aside from GitHub though, is that you tend to be willing to take on more risk, right? You're willing to divert and try something new because you know you can go back to a known good. And you can also sleep well at night knowing that your changes are saved. So use GitHub, check in as often as possible, and all that good stuff. All right, number 8. There is a debug version of the SDK. Now, I tried to find this on our developer portal, and I wish it was a little more prevalent, but I'll have to find out why and ask if we can make it more prevalent. But know that there is a debug version of the SDK. The reason why this is valuable is that when you're debugging in the console and you get like some stack trace and you click on the the little file where the error is, the debug SDK will actually show you sort of uh, uh, the English version, non-minified version of the code, so you kind of get a sense of where it's broken and actually read the code, the internal code better. Now, the rake-based app build system, the app template that we were using earlier, they have an option called rake debug, and if I'd run that, it would create a local file, and I could load that up in the browser. And if you looked inside at the script tag, as you see in the bottom half of this slide, the script tag actually referenced the debug version of the whoops. Oh, come on. The debug it referenced the debug version of the SDK. Now, if you're doing something manual, maybe you can put it in yourself. If you're using the developer kit, know that you can run the debug mode and get this sort of for free. You don't have to worry about it. It's definitely kind of behind the scenes. Know it exists because if you start having problems debugging the app, and you start and you're traversing into the actual SDK itself, that'll be impossible to find. And in fact, if you like 2 videos ago on the building a general app, I had an exception, and I was using the regular SDK. And I remember going into the console, I was like, "Oh, I'm never going to find that." And I went and found it manually, and I was like, "Darn, I should have been using the SDK, the debug version of the SDK." Okay, number 9. Bookmark your API guides and references. These 3 are the important ones. The first one is the actual Rally SDK and API. This is our Rally portal, the developer.rallydev.com. This has the Rally SDK in our API. This has the XJS API. You can browse the API, and it has the Rally guides and tutorials. It's convenient that we have the API for Ext there as well. So as you saw, I was looking at like the object.each method earlier, and some other utilities for looping, for doing some looping and stuff. So it's convenient. You can go into the Ext API directly there, but you don't have all those the guides and tutorials for it. So that's why on the second one here, I mentioned the XJS SDK and API and the X guides at docs.sencha.com. Bookmark that link. That's the Sencha portal, right? So it's not Rally, it's the Sencha portal, but just a wealth of tutorials and guides and videos on just the XJS framework and what's possible. And some great examples of what's possible too. And the third one is the Web Service API. I didn't touch on this in any of the sessions here. I mentioned it a few times. I didn't want to go there yet. You can get there from the developer.rallydev.com portal on the left-hand side there. You have to log in with your Rally credentials, but this is basically the Rally object model. So if you want to say, hey, I'm creating a grid and I want to show stories, and what fields can I show for stories, this is where you want to go. That's how you know that it's name with a capital N or schedule state with camel case S's or whatever. This is the official guide for what fields are available. It's a versioned API and all that good stuff as well. All right, and the last one, number 10. When in doubt, phone a friend, or a few thousand of them on Stack Overflow. We have a great community, a growing community growing over at Stack Overflow. There's the URL there. You can go post questions. You can help the community by answering questions, vote up questions, and all that good stuff. This is a great place to go, especially if you have a very arcane, esoteric, very detailed, crazy problem. Folks are monitoring that. Our support folks are monitoring it. I'm monitoring it. Other technical folks at Rally are monitoring it. So you have a very, very strong community there able to help you out. So the last slide here, getting a little sad because this is the last slide of all the sessions. I want to just be complete and put all of the resources that we've seen to date from all the sessions. Again, highlighting the developer portal, the docs.sencha.com, the Sencha portal, the 2 books I mentioned the JavaScript The Good Parts by Douglas Crockford and Learning High Charts by Joe Kwan, as well as the High Charts extension page and GitHub site by Joe Kwan, describing that connection for High Charts and XJS, and then also the Stack Overflow forms that I just mentioned. Let's go back. Those are the 10 tips. I hope these tips help you feel more comfortable, help you be more productive, and really just make this a fun, rewarding experience when you're working with the Rally SDK, extending our platform, I want you to have a lot of fun. I hope you're able to get access to the data in Rally, visualize it in ways that haven't been done yet, and give you insights into your own data and help you make great decisions. I've enjoyed doing these last several sessions here. It's 11:54 at night on a Saturday. That's how much fun this is. Thank you for listening and watching, and I hope I have a chance to do some more of these soon. Thank you.